The orbital kitchens of Station Valorum gleamed like diamonds against the void, where the galaxy's elite paid fortunes for meals that took months to prepare. In the heart of its most exclusive restaurant, a single father worked the line with calloused hands, invisible to patrons who wouldn't recognize brilliance in a chef's coat stained with yesterday's service. But when the daughter of the syndicate's most feared warlord rejected every delicacy on the menu, something impossible happened. The chef reached for the cheapest thing in his station, a simple hot dog, and what he did with it would rewrite the rules of an empire built on excess. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Station Valorum hung in the black like a jeweled crown, its spires catching starlight from 3 suns. Inside its crystal corridors, the wealthy moved like silk, and through water, their scales and feathers and luminescent skin marking them as the galaxy's chosen. And deep within the station's heart, where heat bloomed like a fever and metal sang against metal, Nathan Cross worked the line with the steady rhythm of a man who had learned to make himself small. Constellation was not a restaurant, it was a temple to excess, where meals cost more than most species earned in a year. The dining hall stretched upward into manufactured twilight, tables floating on anti-grav platforms among holographic constellations that shifted with each course. Waiters glided between them like priests, carrying plates that steamed with rarities harvested from dying worlds. The kitchen below was all fire and chrome, a machine that fed the myth of luxury to those who had forgotten what hunger felt like. Nathan stood at his station, third from the end, where the hierarchy placed humans who had no business cooking for their betters. His coat was clean but worn, white fabric, gone grey at the elbows. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, julienning vegetables that cost more per pound than his daughter's school fees. Around him, alien chefs barked orders in 9 languages, their voices sharp with contempt that needed no translation. He did not respond. He had learned years ago that silence was its own kind of armor. Above his station, a small hollow frame flickered with a recorded message. His daughter Emma, 7 years old with brown hair falling across one eye, waving at the camera. Nathan had watched it 43 times today during the brief moments when head chef Vexor's attention turned elsewhere. She was on Earth, living with his sister, while Nathan worked contracts that kept her fed and schooled and safe from the kind of poverty that ate futures. The frame was supposed to be motivational, a reminder of why he endured the burns and the sneers and the exhaustion that lived in his bones. Most days, it worked. Tonight, Station Valorum prepared for the unexpected. Word had traveled through the kitchen like electricity through water. A ship had docked without warning, bearing the colors of the Syndicate, the war engine that held 12 systems in its fist. Warlord Thessa herself was aboard, traveling with her daughter, and Constellation had exactly 2 hours to prove it deserved to exist. Head chef Vexor, a towering Silurian with 4 arms and a temperament like shattered glass, moved through the kitchen like a storm, his voice rising to a shriek that made the walls hum. Nathan kept his head down and prepped his station. He had survived worse than warlords. The first sign was the silence. Constellation's dining hall, usually filled with the musical chatter of the wealthy, went quiet as a held breath. Nathan felt it, even in the kitchen, the way air pressure drops before a storm. Then came the sound of boots, heavy and synchronized, the march of soldiers who had forgotten how to walk any other way. Head chef Vexor's 4 arms froze, mid-gesture, his eye stalk swiveling toward the kitchen's observation window. Through the reinforced glass, Nathan watched them enter. Warlord Thessa moved like a glacier given purpose. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her exoskeleton the color of burnished copper, etched with scars that told stories in a language Nathan didn't want to learn. Her janjar was minimal, just enough plating to suggest she didn't fear death because death feared her. Behind her walked 12 guards, their weapons holstered but hands resting on grips with the casualness of certainty. And between 2 of those guards, barely visible in the forest of armored legs, walked a child. She was small, even for her species. blue skin with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed faintly along her temples, large eyes the color of Earth's oceans before the pollution. She wore a dress that seemed too formal, too heavy, the kind of clothing chosen by someone who didn't understand what children needed. Her name whispered through the kitchen like a curse. Zira, the warlord's only daughter, the heir to 12 systems of conquest. She was 6 years old. Vexor exploded into motion. His voice cracked through the kitchen like a whip, orders flying in 3 directions at once. The Crolusian steaks, aged for 16 months in meteor ice. The Vayari honey wine, bottled during the bloom that happened once per generation. The Silurian fire fruit, harvested at the moment of supernova and preserved in temporal stasis. Every delicacy constellation possessed, every ingredient that existed to remind the wealthy they were not like others, was to be prepared with a perfection that transcended the possible. Chefs scrambled, their previous contempt for each other dissolving into the unity of shared terror. No one refused a warlord. No one survived disappointing one. Nathan watched through the window as Zira was seated at a table that lowered itself to her height. The guards formed a perimeter. Thessa remained standing, her presence filling the room like a color that had no name. Servers approached with the first course, moving as though the floor might shatter beneath them. A plate of crystallized star matter, glowing faintly, arranged in patterns that mimicked her home system's constellation. The child looked at it with eyes that held something Nathan recognized. Not defiance, not anger. Fear. The kind of fear that came from disappointing people over and over until you stopped trying. Zira pushed the plate away. The server's hands trembled. In the kitchen, Vexor's bellow could have stripped paint from walls. The second course was already moving, pulled from ovens that cost more than starships. Nathan's station was not involved in any of it. He was too low in the hierarchy to touch food meant for warlords, so he watched, and he saw what the others were too panicked to notice. The child was not being difficult. She was drowning. The plates kept coming, each more elaborate than the last. Vexor's forearms conducted the kitchen like a frenzied orchestra, pulling dishes from stations with movements too fast to track. Through the observation window, Nathan watched the parade of rejection. Zira pushed away the Throlusian caviar that shimmered like captured starlight. She turned her head from the Kelvan root, aged in volcanic ash, until it sang with umami depth. When they brought the Falarian cloud cream, whipped into architectural impossibility and dusted with powdered nebula, she didn't even look at it. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale beneath blue skin, and Nathan saw her shoulders begin to shake. The dining hall had become a theater of tension. Other patrons had stopped eating, their attention fixed on the small drama unfolding at the lowered table. Some watched with the fascination of those who enjoyed watching power navigate discomfort. Others seemed genuinely disturbed, perhaps remembering children of their own. Thessa stood motionless behind her daughter, her face unreadable behind the warrior's mask she wore like a second skin. But her hand, Nathan noticed, had moved to rest on the back of Zira's chair. Not threatening, protective. In the kitchen, panic metastasized into rage. Vexor seized a junior chef by the collar, lifting him off the ground with 2 arms, while the other 2 gestured violently at a plate of something that looked like living geometry. The junior chef's translator barely kept pace with the invective. Useless, incompetent, unworthy of the station's heir. Nathan had heard it all before, directed at himself and others. The vocabulary of a hierarchy that measured worth in cruelty. Around him, chefs moved with the desperate energy of those who knew their careers, perhaps their lives, hung on satisfying an impossible child. But Nathan wasn't watching the chefs. He was watching Zira's hands, the way they gripped the table. He was watching the slight forward hunch of her shoulders, the way her head tilted down as though trying to make herself smaller. He had seen that posture before, on video calls, when Emma was trying to be brave about something that scared her. When his sister's cooking didn't taste like home. When the other kids at school made her feel alien for having a father who worked in space. When she missed him so badly the words wouldn't come. Only that quiet shake that preceded tears. Nathan's hands stilled over his prep station. Around him, the kitchen churned with motion, chefs pulling ingredients from thermal lockers and molecular separators, constructing plates that belonged in museums rather than stomachs. Vexer was screaming orders for the final attempt, something involving a protein so rare that only 3 had ever been harvested, aged in the light of a dying star until it achieved a tenderness beyond description. It would cost more than Nathan earned in 5 years. It would be plated with edible gold and served on crystal that sang when touched. And Nathan knew, with the certainty of a father who had learned to read silence, that Zira would push it away too. Because she wasn't hungry for delicacies, she was homesick. Nathan's station held nothing valuable by Constellation standards. Root vegetables that would become garnish, herbs for stocks no patron would ever see. There, and in the back corner of his cold locker, wrapped in standard preservation film, a package of hot dogs. Cheap protein, processed and formed, the kind of food served in station mess halls and school cafeterias across human space. He had bought them 3 weeks ago during a supply run, planning to eat them during the double shifts when Vexer didn't allow meal breaks. They cost less than a single garnish leaf on the plates being rushed to Zira's table. He pulled the package out. The kitchen swirled around him, a hurricane of desperation and expensive failure. No one was watching his station. No one ever watched his station unless they needed someone to blame. His hands moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 meals cooked for Emma, back when they'd lived together in the small apartment on Earth, before the money ran out and choices narrowed to the width of a blade. He fired up his small corner grill, the one he used for staff meals, and laid the hot dog down with the gentleness usually reserved for ingredients worth more than starships. The sear was everything. He had learned that from his grandmother, who had cooked in diners before Earth's economy collapsed into the galactic one. Heat was a language, she'd told him, and if you listened, food would tell you what it needed. He listened now. The hot dog began to sing, its casing crisping, sugars caramelizing in stripes where metal met meat. He turned it with tongs worn smooth by years, watching the color deepen from pink to bronze to that perfect edge of char that meant flavor had been coaxed from simplicity. While it cooked, he toasted a bun. Not the synthesized foam constellation used for texture components, but a real bun, from the staff supplies, soft and plain and honest. The scent hit him first. Smoky, salty, carrying memories of childhood and safety, and meals that didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Around him, 3 chefs paused mid-motion, their faces registering confusion. That smell didn't belong here. It was too simple, too clean, too much like food instead of art. Nathan plated the hot dog on a standard white dish, no garnish, no architectural foam, no edible metals. He added a line of mustard, the cheap yellow kind that Emma loved, and a modest stripe of ketchup. Then he did something that should have been impossible. He walked toward the kitchen exit that led to the dining hall. Vexer saw him. The head chef's eye stalks whipped around, his forearms spreading in a gesture of absolute negation, his mouth opened to release the kind of scream that ended careers. But Nathan was already through the door, moving with the steady purpose of a man who had calculated the cost and decided his daughter would understand. The dining hall fell silent for the second time that night. Every eye tracked the human line cook in his stained coat, carrying a plate that held something they couldn't name. Nathan crossed the dining hall with the same steady rhythm he used in the kitchen, neither hurrying nor hesitating. The anti-grav tables hung in the manufactured twilight like islands of judgment, their occupants frozen in postures of disbelief. A human approaching the warlord's table uninvited. A line cook carrying something that smelled like poverty. The guards' hands moved to their weapons with synchronized precision, but Nathan's eyes were on Zira. She had lifted her head. Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed faster, responding to the scent reaching her across the pristine air. He knelt beside her table, bringing himself to her eye level. It was the same motion he used on video calls with Emma, making himself small so she wouldn't feel overwhelmed. Zira's ocean-colored eyes went wide, not with fear but with something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. the understanding that someone was finally seeing her as more than an extension of her mother's power. Nathan set the plate down gently, the white ceramic foreign against the table's crystalline surface. The hot dog sat in its honest simplicity, steam rising in a thin line toward the holographic stars above. Zira looked at her mother. Thessa's copper exoskeleton caught the light, making her seem carved from old warnings. But her hand moved in a small gesture, 3 fingers lifted briefly. Permission, or perhaps curiosity about where this would end. Zira reached for the hot dog with both hands, the way children do when they're truly hungry. No practiced manners or formal grace. She brought it to her lips and bit. The sound of her chewing was the loudest thing in the room. Then her eyes filled with tears that caught the light like tiny moons. She didn't cry from sadness. Nathan had seen Emma cry like this once, when his sister had finally figured out how to make the bread pudding his grandmother used to make, the one that tasted like every good memory compressed into sweetness. Relief tears, the kind that came when something you'd been missing so desperately you couldn't name it finally came home. Zira ate with the single-minded focus of childhood hunger satisfied at last, and around the dining hall, alien faces registered confusion that bordered on philosophical crisis. The warlord's daughter was weeping over peasant food. Thessa moved. Her footsteps were silent despite her size, her armor whispering against itself like a secret being kept. She stopped beside Nathan, close enough that he could see the etchings in her exoskeleton were not decorative. They were tallies. Marks for every battle survived, every system conquered. She looked down at him with eyes that held the weight of worlds, and when she spoke, her voice was not the roar he'd expected. It was quiet, precise, the voice of someone who had learned that true power needed no volume. "What did you do differently?" she asked. Nathan stood slowly, aware that he was crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. He met her gaze with the steadiness of someone who had already lost everything that mattered once and survived it. His answer came from the place where he kept his daughter's recorded messages, where memory lived as both wound and compass. "I cooked for a child, not a warlord," said Nathan. Thessa stood motionless for 3 heartbeats, her copper exoskeleton reflecting the holographic stars that drifted overhead. Around them, the dining hall held its collective breath, waiting for violence or dismissal or some display of power that would restore the universe to its proper order. Instead, the warlord did something none of them expected. She sat down at her daughter's table, lowering herself with the careful control of someone whose body was a weapon even in rest. Zira looked up from her hot dog, sauce, at the corner of her mouth, eyes still bright with relief tears. "You are either brilliant or foolish," said Thessa. Her voice carried across the hall with perfect clarity, despite its softness. Nathan said nothing. He had learned in kitchens that sometimes the best response was silence, letting others fill the space with their own conclusions. Thessa's gaze moved from him to her daughter, watching Zira take another bite with the contentment of a child who had finally found solid ground. "Perhaps both," said Thessa. "My war council arrives tomorrow. 20 generals who have forgotten what food tastes like beneath all the status it carries. You will cook for them." The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Nathan understood immediately. This was not an honor. It was a test designed to expose him as either lucky or fraudulent, to prove that his success with Zira was accident rather than skill. Head chef Vexor had appeared at the kitchen entrance, his 4 arms crossed in a posture of vindicated anticipation. He stepped forward with the oily confidence of someone who smelled blood in the water. "Of course, Warlord Thessa," said Vexor. "Our finest ingredients, prepared by our master chefs, with this human assisting as appropriate for his station." Thessa's mandibles clicked once, a sound like stones striking together. "No," said Thessa. "Only him, only ingredients your soldiers eat. No delicacies, no rarities, no foods that cost more than weapons." Shock rippled through the hall like a stone dropped in still water. Vexor's eye stalks retracted slightly, confusion disrupting his smugness. "But, Warlord, surely," said Vexor. "Your status demands," began Vexor. "My status demands nothing," said Thessa. "My curiosity demands answers." This human fed my daughter something your temple of excess could not provide. Let us see if he can feed warriors who have forgotten they were once children too." Nathan felt the weight of every eye in Constellation settle on his shoulders. The other patrons leaned forward in their floating chairs, sensing entertainment. Vexor's expression had shifted from shock to barely concealed delight. He had watched Nathan work for 2 years, had seen nothing but competent mediocrity, the ceiling of human potential. A line cook asked to prepare a feast for war. Generals using military rations would fail spectacularly, publicly, and Vexor's universe would restore itself to proper hierarchy. The head chef bowed with exaggerated grace. "As you wish," said Vexor. "I will personally oversee his his preparation." Nathan looked at Zira one more time. She smiled at him, a small thing with ketchup-stained teeth, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 2 years loosened slightly. He nodded to Thessa. "Tomorrow," said Nathan. The War Council arrived with the weight of conquered systems in their wake. They filled Constellation's private hall like a collection of nightmares given form and purpose. Generals from species Nathan had only seen in news feeds about border conflicts and territorial annexations. A Crolution with armor that had fused to his carapace after centuries of battle. A Vayari whose bioluminescent patterns had gone dark from too many years in warship corridors. A Silurian missing 3 of her 6 limbs, the stumps capped with weapon mounts. 20 beings who had forgotten softness existed. Nathan stood in the kitchen surrounded by crates of military rations. Protein blocks that tasted like textured regret. Dehydrated vegetables engineered for nutrition rather than flavor, carbohydrate paste that came in tubes and kept soldiers moving when hope ran out. Vexor circled the pile with unconcealed glee, his 4 arms gesturing at the poverty of ingredients. "This is what you have chosen to work with," said Vexor. "Please, enlighten us with your peasant magic." The other chefs watched from their stations, some pitying, most anticipating the entertainment of watching Nathan crash against his own limitations. Nathan lifted a protein block, turning it in his hands the way his grandmother had taught him to examine ingredients. She had cooked through Earth's collapse, through the years when real meat became myth, and people learned to make do with synthesis and substitution. "Food is a story," she had told him, her hands kneading dough in their kitchen that smelled like yeast and determination. Even the humblest ingredients remember where they came from. You just have to listen hard enough to hear it. He began with the protein blocks, cutting them into precise cubes. His knife moved with the rhythm of meditation, each piece exactly the same size, so they would cook evenly. He built a marinade from things the kitchen had dismissed as worthless. The burnt ends of vegetables destined for compost, their concentrated sweetness like caramel made from necessity. Herbs that had wilted past the point of garnish beauty, but held their flavor like a secret. Salt and acid and thyme, the holy trinity his grandmother had sworn by. While the protein absorbed its new story, he turned to the dehydrated vegetables. Rehydration was an art form. Too fast, and they turned to mush, their cell walls collapsing under the weight of rushed water. Too slow, and they never recovered their dignity. Nathan worked with the patience of someone who understood that transformation required respect. He blanched them in stock he built from kitchen scraps, the bones and peels and trimmings that Constellation threw away by the kilogram. The stock simmered for hours, becoming golden, becoming memory. The vegetables drank it in and remembered they had once grown under suns. The carbohydrate paste he treated like clay, adding flour from the staff supplies and working it with his hands until it became dough. He rolled it thin, cut it into irregular shapes, and fried them until they shattered like glass made from grain. His grandmother's voice echoed in his movements. "Make it honest," she had said. "Make it true." The first course went out on plain plates. No crystal, no floating presentations, just ceramic warm from the oven. Nathan had seared the marinated protein until it carried char marks like battle scars earned honorably. Beside it, the rehydrated vegetables glistened with the stock that had given them back their dignity. The fried carbohydrate shards stood, arranged like small monuments to the possibility of transformation. Servers carried the plates into the private hall with confusion evident in their movements. This was not food meant for generals. This was food meant for soldiers who remembered being human, or whatever their species called the state before war hardened them into weapons. Through the observation window, Nathan watched the War Council receive their plates. They looked at the food with expressions ranging from bewilderment to something approaching offense. The Crolusian general lifted a piece of protein on his fork, examining it as though it might contain poison or insult. He placed it in his mandibles, chewed once, then stopped, his ancient eyes going distant as though seeing across years instead of across the table. The Vayari general's bioluminescent patterns flickered, then began to pulse with colors Nathan recognized from Zira. Not the muted darkness of permanent war, but the soft rhythms of memory. One by one, the generals began to eat with a focus that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with recognition. The second course followed. Nathan had taken the despised carbohydrate paste and transformed it into something his grandmother called comfort. He had cooked it slow with the vegetable stock, stirring until it became creamy, adding herbs that spoke of home rather than conquest. He topped it with the protein, now braised until it fell apart at the suggestion of a fork, and finished it with a drizzle of oil, infused with the burnt vegetable ends that carried sweetness earned through survival. It was peasant food elevated, not through expense but through care. It was the food soldiers dreamed about in the moments between battles, when they remembered they had once been children who laughed. The hall went silent except for the sound of eating, then, impossibly, the sound of weeping. The Solurian general, scarred and weapon-mounted, set down her fork with a hand that trembled. Her translator carried her words with crystal clarity. "I had forgotten," she said, her voice cracked like old ice. "I had forgotten that food could taste like mercy." Another general, species Nathan didn't recognize, wiped at eyes that leaked fluid the color of storms. "My mother made something like this," said the general, "before I learned to kill, before I forgot her name." Thessa sat at the head of the table, untouched plate before her. She had not eaten, had only watched her war council dissolve into something she had not seen in decades. Vulnerability, the return of selves they had buried under armor and duty, and the weight of systems held through force. She looked through the observation window directly at Nathan, her expression unreadable as a closed text. Then she lifted her fork and tasted what he had made. Her eyes closed. When they opened, they held something that might have been rage, or might have been grief, or might have been the space where both lived as twins. The War Council departed in silence, their ships leaving Station Valorum like ghosts retreating from a dawn they hadn't expected to see. Nathan cleaned his station with the methodical movements of ritual, scrubbing away the evidence of transformation until only steel remained. Around him, the kitchen had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the usual contempt. The other chefs watched him with expressions that couldn't decide between resentment and something approaching respect. Vexer had disappeared into his office after the final course, his forearms wrapped around himself as though holding in words that might escape and destroy him. Nathan was rinsing the last pan when Thessa entered the kitchen. She had to duck through the doorway, her copper exoskeleton scraping the frame with a sound like a sword being drawn. Every chef froze. Warlords did not enter kitchens. Kitchens were beneath notice, the mechanical hearts that pumped food into the mouths of those who mattered. But Thessa moved through the space with the same careful control she had shown at her daughter's table, her gaze taking in the hierarchy of stations, the worn equipment in the corner where humans worked, the gleaming molecular separators reserved for those deemed worthy of precision. She stopped at Nathan's station. In her hand, she held a small data crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. "My personal ship leaves in 6 hours," said Thessa. "You will come with me as my household chef. Your daughter will be brought from Earth within the week. You will have quarters appropriate to your value, staff to assist you, and compensation that will erase the word poverty from your family's vocabulary for 3 generations." Her voice carried no room for negotiation. It was the voice that had conquered 12 systems, that bent species to her will through the simple fact of her existence. Nathan set down the pan with careful precision. His hands were raw from the chemicals, the burns, the years of work that had carved themselves into his skin like a map of choices made under duress. He thought of Emma, 7 years old and living with his sister because he couldn't afford to keep her close. He thought of the school fees and the medical bills and the slow erosion of dreaming that came from counting every credit. He thought of his grandmother, who had died in a kitchen not unlike this one, her hands still smelling of flour and her dignity intact, despite the poverty that had stalked her life like a patient predator. The offer was everything he needed, everything Emma needed: security, stability, the chance to build a future instead of merely surviving the present. And all it would cost was cooking for an empire built on conquest, feeding the machine that ground systems into submission, becoming complicit in the very hierarchy that had made him invisible. His holocom chimed softly. Emma's scheduled call, arriving with the timing of the universe's terrible sense of irony. He looked at Tessa with eyes that held 2 years of silence, finally finding words. "May I answer this first?" said Nathan. Emma's face filled the small, hollow frame, pixelated at the edges where the cheap connection strained across light years. She wore the shirt he had sent for her birthday, already too small because children grew faster than contracts paid. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone trying to hide worry. "Aunt Sarah said you got in trouble at work. Are you okay?" Nathan knelt so their eyes would be level across the impossible distance. "I did something that scared people," he said, "but it was the right thing. Do you understand the difference?" Emma's face went serious in the way children's faces do when they're deciding whether to trust the world. Her grandmother's eyes looked out from her features, brown and clear and capable of seeing through pretense to the truth beneath. "You always tell me that doing right is more important than doing easy," said Emma. Even when it cost something, Nathan felt his throat tighten. His daughter, 7 years old, already understanding the mathematics of integrity. "Yes," said Nathan. "Even then, especially then." Tessa had moved closer, drawn by the hologram. She looked down at Emma with an expression Nathan couldn't name. Something in her ancient warrior's face softening like ice acknowledging spring. "Your daughter," said Tessa. "She has your eyes." Nathan nodded. Tessa was silent for a long moment, watching Emma wave at the camera, watching this small human child who lived light years from her father because survival required separation. When Tessa spoke again, her voice had changed texture, becoming something that might have been memory or regret, or the recognition that even warlords were shaped by the children they raised. "I offer you a different arrangement," said Tessa. "Teach my chefs what you know, not recipes but philosophy, not techniques but truth. Transform how my empire feeds itself, starting with the soldiers who have forgotten that food can be mercy. Your daughter comes to the station, lives with you, attends the academy with Zira. You answer to no one regarding what you cook or how you teach it. And when your contract ends, you leave with wealth enough to choose what comes next." Her mandibles clicked softly. "I do not want to own you, Nathan Cross. I want to learn from you. There is a difference." Nathan looked at Emma's face in the hologram, then at Tessa's face carved with the history of conquest. He thought of his grandmother's hands working dough, of Zira's tears over a simple hot dog, of 20 generals weeping into plates of transformed rations. He thought of all the invisible people working stations across the galaxy, their skills dismissed because hierarchy required someone to stand on. His answer came from the place where his daughter's voice lived, where memory met possibility, where simple things held the power to shift empires, not through force, but through the quiet insistence of dignity recognized. "I accept," said Nathan. "But I teach in my grandmother's kitchen too, the one we build for people the galaxy forgets." Tessa's eyes gleamed like copper catching fire. "Then we begin tomorrow," she said. And the station learned that sometimes revolution starts with a hot dog,